What's up, Multiverse of Mayhem fans? Today, we're diving into one of the most controversial debates in modern Star Wars history. And unlike the prequels, where opinions have gradually softened over 2 decades, this conversation is still happening in real time. Because we're talking about the Star Wars Sequel Trilogy, 3 films that earned billions at the box office, introduced a new generation of heroes, brought back the original cast, divided the fan base unlike anything since the prequels, and somehow managed to be simultaneously loved, hated, praised, criticized, and endlessly debated all at the same time. When The Force Awakens released in 2015, it felt like Star Wars had returned. The excitement was unbelievable. Fans who grew up with the original trilogy were introducing Star Wars to their kids. The franchise was back on the big screen after a decade-long absence. New characters were being introduced, familiar heroes were returning, and perhaps most importantly, audiences felt hopeful about the future of Star Wars. But by the time The Rise of Skywalker arrived in 2019, the conversations surrounding the trilogy had become one of the most polarized debates in franchise history. So what happened? Is the sequel trilogy a misunderstood masterpiece that fans will eventually appreciate the same way many now appreciate the prequels? Or is it a case study in wasted potential, a trilogy filled with great ideas that never fully came together? Today, we're taking a deep dive into episodes 7, 8, and 9 to answer one simple question: wasted potential or misunderstood masterpiece? To understand the sequel trilogy, we first need to understand the impossible challenge it faced. The original trilogy wasn't just successful, it changed cinema forever. These weren't simply movies, they became cultural landmarks. Then came the prequels, which spent years dealing with criticism before eventually earning a re-evaluation from many fans. So when Disney acquired Lucasfilm and announced a new trilogy, expectations weren't high, they were almost impossible. Fans wanted something new, but they also wanted something familiar. They wanted legacy characters, but they also wanted the next generation. They wanted nostalgia, innovation, mystery, answers, and emotional payoff all at the same time. That's an incredibly difficult target for any trilogy to hit. Starting with The Force Awakens, it's important to remember just how successful this movie was at accomplishing its immediate goal. After years of criticism surrounding the prequels, Lucasfilm needed to reintroduce Star Wars to a global audience. And honestly, The Force Awakens did exactly that. The film introduced audiences to Rey, Finn, Poe Dameron, Kylo Ren, and BB-8, while successfully bringing back Han Solo, Leia Organa, and eventually Luke Skywalker. The pacing was energetic. The characters were immediately likable, and many fans walked out of theaters genuinely excited about Star Wars again. But this is also where one of the trilogy's biggest debates begins. Critics and fans quickly noticed similarities between The Force Awakens and A New Hope. A desert orphan discovers a larger destiny. A droid carries important information. A planet-destroying superweapon threatens the galaxy. A mentor figure dies. A young Force-sensitive hero begins their journey. Whether someone views these similarities as respectful homage or excessive repetition largely depends on personal perspective, but the criticism wasn't entirely unfounded. The Force Awakens deliberately leaned heavily into familiar Star Wars imagery and storytelling structures. At the same time, though, the movie introduced some genuinely fascinating ideas. Rey's origins became one of the biggest mysteries in modern Star Wars. Finn offered something completely new, a former stormtrooper breaking free from Imperial-style indoctrination. Kylo Ren immediately stood out because he wasn't trying to be Darth Vader, he was actively obsessed with becoming Darth Vader. That distinction made him one of the most psychologically interesting villains the franchise had introduced in years. Unlike Vader, who projected confidence and authority, Kylo was emotionally unstable, conflicted, impulsive, and constantly struggling with his own identity. Then came The Last Jedi, and honestly, this is where the sequel trilogy transformed from a popular blockbuster series into one of the most debated topics in Star Wars history. Even years later, it's difficult to find a Star Wars film that generates stronger reactions than The Last Jedi. Some fans consider it one of the boldest and most thoughtful films in the franchise. Others see it as a fundamental misunderstanding of Star Wars itself. What's undeniable is that The Last Jedi took risks. Instead of simply providing straightforward answers to every mystery established in The Force Awakens, the film often challenged audience expectations. Luke Skywalker is perhaps the most controversial example. Many fans expected the legendary Jedi Master who would immediately return to heroics. Instead, they found the Luke burdened by failure and regret. Whether someone loves or hates this portrayal, it's important to recognize that the movie intentionally presents Luke as a man struggling with the consequences of his own mistakes rather than as an infallible legend. The film's central theme revolves around failure. Luke fails, Poe fails, Finn fails, Kylo fails. Virtually every major character experiences setbacks, and for supporters of the film, that's exactly what makes it interesting. The Last Jedi repeatedly argues that growth comes from failure rather than success. Yoda's appearance reinforces this idea when he reminds Luke that teachers are often defined by the mistakes they pass on to future generations. The relationship between Rey and Kylo Ren also becomes significantly more complex here. Instead of presenting a traditional hero versus villain dynamic, the film explores the idea that both characters are searching for identity and belonging. Their Force connection creates some of the trilogy's most compelling scenes because it allows them to challenge each other's beliefs directly. Adam Driver's performance as Kylo Ren is particularly strong throughout this film, as the character evolves beyond simply being a Vader admirer and begins establishing his own identity. However, many criticisms of The Last Jedi are also legitimate discussion points. Some viewers felt certain subplots disrupted the pacing. Others believed key character decisions contradicted previous portrayals. The film's willingness to challenge expectations impressed some audiences while frustrating others. And perhaps most importantly, The Last Jedi left the trilogy in an unusual position. By the end of the film, Supreme Leader Snoke was dead, Kylo Ren had taken control, and many of the mystery box questions established in The Force Awakens had been resolved in unexpected ways. That brings us to The Rise of Skywalker, arguably the most difficult film in the trilogy to analyze, because unlike The Last Jedi, where the debate often centers around creative choices, discussions surrounding The Rise of Skywalker frequently focus on narrative cohesion. The film had the enormous responsibility of concluding not just the sequel trilogy, but the entire Skywalker saga. That's more than 40 years of storytelling history resting on one movie. One of the film's most controversial decisions was the return of Emperor Palpatine. This isn't speculation or hindsight criticism. It was genuinely one of the most debated choices among fans upon release. Some viewers enjoyed seeing the saga's ultimate villain return for a final confrontation. Others felt it weakened the significance of Anakin Skywalker's sacrifice in Return of the Jedi. Regardless of where someone stands, it's impossible to discuss the sequel trilogy without acknowledging how much conversation this decision generated. The Rise of Skywalker also attempts to answer lingering questions about Rey's origins, ultimately revealing her connection to Palpatine's bloodline. Again, reactions were mixed. Some fans appreciated giving Rey a direct connection to the larger saga. Others preferred The Last Jedi's suggestion that heroism and Force sensitivity could emerge from ordinary backgrounds. The debate itself highlights one of the trilogy's central challenges. Different creative teams often emphasized different themes and priorities. And honestly, this brings us to the biggest criticism of the sequel trilogy as a whole. Not acting, visual effects, music, or production design, but long-term planning. Unlike the original trilogy, which evolved under George Lucas's creative leadership, or the prequels, which were written and directed by Lucas himself, the sequel trilogy featured multiple directors and writers with differing creative approaches. That's not automatically a flaw. Many successful franchises use multiple filmmakers. But in the case of the sequel trilogy, some viewers felt the overarching narrative lacked the level of cohesion they expected from a three-film saga. Now here's where things get interesting, because despite all the criticism, there are elements of the sequel trilogy that deserve enormous credit. The visual effects are consistently spectacular. The practical creature work often feels like a natural evolution of the original trilogy aesthetic. John Williams once again delivered memorable musical themes despite being decades into his Star Wars career. And perhaps most importantly, the casting was outstanding. Daisy Ridley carried the enormous responsibility of leading a new generation of Star Wars films. John Boyega brought tremendous charisma and humanity to Finn. Oscar Isaac transformed Poe Dameron into one of the trilogy's most entertaining characters, and Adam Driver delivered what many fans consider one of the strongest performances in the entire saga. Kylo Ren remains one of the sequel trilogy's greatest achievements because he's fundamentally different from previous Star Wars villains. He's not a completed monster, he's a deeply conflicted person, constantly at war with himself. And then there's the question that always emerges whenever discussions about the sequel trilogy happen. Legacy. How will these films be remembered 20 years from now? If the prequels taught us anything, it's that audience perceptions can change dramatically over time. Many younger fans today grew up with Rey, Finn, Poe, and Kylo Ren the same way previous generations grew up with Luke, Leia, Han, Obi-Wan, and Anakin. Nostalgia alone won't transform opinions, but future projects could potentially expand and deepen aspects of this era the same way the Clone Wars expanded the prequel era. So after looking at the entire trilogy, what's the verdict? Is the Star Wars Sequel Trilogy a misunderstood masterpiece? Not quite. The trilogy contains too many unresolved debates about direction, narrative consistency, and long-term planning to fit comfortably into that category. But is it simply wasted potential? That's not entirely accurate either, because wasted potential suggests there was nothing worthwhile beneath the surface, and that's clearly not true. The sequel trilogy introduced compelling characters, delivered genuinely emotional moments, explored ambitious themes about legacy and identity, and produced some of the most visually stunning Star Wars sequences ever filmed. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The sequel trilogy isn't a disaster, and it isn't a masterpiece. It's a fascinating collection of films filled with extraordinary strengths, ambitious ideas, memorable characters, and undeniable creative tensions. Its biggest achievements are genuinely impressive, its biggest frustrations are equally real, and perhaps that's why the debate continues years later. Because unlike truly forgettable movies, the sequel trilogy still inspires passionate discussion from every corner of the fandom. So there you have it, our honest deep dive into the Star Wars sequel trilogy. Not a simplistic defense, not a complete takedown, just an attempt to examine what worked, what didn't, and why these movies remain some of the most debated entries in Star Wars history. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think the sequel trilogy is misunderstood? Do you think it squandered its potential? Or do you fall somewhere in the middle? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, smash that like button, subscribe to Multiverse of Mayhem, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next breakdown. Until next time, stay chaotic, stay informed, and remember, the multiverse is mayhem. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.